let me tell you a little bit about why Willis decided to sponsor this ambitious, risky expedition. It all started when Steve Hearn received an email. Now, of course, we know that Parker didn't send it to anyone else, but only sent it to us, asking whether we'd be interested in sponsoring him. And we got very excited about this very quickly, because it fit very well with our positioning of our firm around what we do is provide resilience for a risky world. And we thought this project was about expertise and scientific research, ambition and resilience in the face of the risk of failure, analytics, and we're very focused on analytics as helping people manage their risks. Of course, it's one thing to write a check, and there's another thing actually to employ risk management. And we decided to go all in, particularly as my major concern, and which I can only now reveal now to Parker, was that Parker died on doing this enterprise. This was my concern. And I said, therefore, we need to do something about that. So that meant we had to really think about the safety of this event. Right? So that meant creating a tracking vehicle, which you will see photographs of, to follow Parker. By the way, I explicitly said that the thing I was most concerned about was that Parker would fall down a crevasse, and that it was very important that we had the truck on hand to pull him out in case that happened. Until I was told halfway through the expedition, he had decided to take a shortcut through a crevasse field where the truck couldn't go. And Parker, you and I still need to catch up on that. Anyway, we created the truck which followed him around. That enabled us to have live satellite broadcasts along the trip. That enabled us to actually tell a much larger story about what's going on in our world. And we set up a separate website called willisresilience.com, and we actually had 16 hours of coverage of his expedition, along with lots of interviews with experts in the field about what is going on in our world. The expedition was divided into 2 phases. The first phase was about scientific research that may help us answer a number of critical questions, and also the launching of a new weather station on Antarctica. And the second phase began on December the 3rd, which was about resilience. And it ended on Christmas Eve at 13:43 GMT, when Parker and his co-adventurer Doug arrived at the South Pole after a completely unsupported journey. There was a truck in the distance, but he wasn't allowed to touch it or do anything with it, on foot, covering 565 miles over 18 days, 4 hours and 43 minutes, setting the new world record for walking from the coast to the South Pole. We think this is, however, just the first chapter in Parker's journey to tell his story, and our commitment as a firm, Willis's commitment, to be continuously involved in what he does, but also continuously involved in science around what's going on in our world and helping business understand how it manages the risks that are emerging as a result.
Thanks, Dominic, for your introduction. Very kind of you. And I appreciate how hectic everything is at Davos. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know that none of you came to the World Economic Forum to hear about some random teenager's Christmas vacation. So I would like to offer a little bit of context to the expedition to begin with, in particular the reasons why we were doing it. 2013 was a landmark year for climate change. It was anchored by the first phase of the release of the IPCC's 5th assessment report, which basically reaffirmed what everyone was expecting it to do, so which was that reaffirmed the certainty of the human contribution to climate change, the need for drastic and very rapid cuts in emissions, and the need for a global action on an urgent timescale. But we also saw in 2013 that there continues to be a gap between what the scientific community has found and the scientific community believes as a consensus, and what people around the world are willing to support, act on, understand, and believe. So what that means is there's a very well-known figure 97% of climate scientists agree that global warming is human-caused. 47% of Americans believe it, and only 25% of Americans know that there is any consensus at all. To focus on a more global perspective, because that's why we're here really, in Davos, it was only a couple years ago that about 30% of people around the world understood the human impact, or that global warming was related to human activity. So, and at the time, around 35% of people around the world, according to the polls obviously, didn't know what global warming was. So there is a responsibility within my generation to address climate change, especially to work with the current set of policymakers, world leaders, scientists, communicators, expert risk managers. But in order for this to be possible, and this is in the context of addressing, becoming more prepared for the risks and the changes that are occurring and that will be happening in the future. In order for this to be possible, we need to remove the divisions that exist between science and society. So when I approached Steve and Dominic about 10 months ago, the idea behind this expedition was that we can go beyond science. We can do the scientific research and then go beyond that to influence the policy debate and influence how and communicate science accurately to people. So not too long ago, I was working at a lab in California, and the climate scientist I was working for connected me to another scientist at an institute called GNS New Zealand. They house the most accurate tritium analysis lab in the world. Now, tritium, which is what we studied on the expedition, is a radioactive form of hydrogen, and it can be used to trace and date water and ice to very accurate, on a very accurate level. Up until very recently, it hasn't been used very much in Antarctica because in the 50s and 60s, there were thermonuclear bomb tests that caused a huge artificial peak in the amount of tritium in the atmosphere. And this graph represents the solid line is the amount that was found in Antarctica. The Kaitoki line is the rain in New Zealand. But now, it's been about a couple decades since the tritium has been washed out and decayed from the atmosphere, which means that if we can understand how tritium varies across Antarctica, we can date very accurately to within a season the age of water and ice, which is critical to helping us understand how the climate system works and how the water cycle works in Antarctica. So the challenge is for us, the next step, the new research is that it turns out tritium varies significantly across Antarctica, so you can't just drill in one site and figure it out. We have to have information from across a continent that's bigger than China and India combined. And so this is what we set out to do with Icebroker, our truck affectionately named by Steve Hearn, and on the science leg of our expedition, in addition to 2 other research programs with the weather station and another isotope program as well. But how does an expedition to the South Pole actually contribute or produce any sort of impact on the policy debate, public opinion? It's not immediately obvious. Now, for me, focused on the capabilities of the truck that were there for the scientific research, but we added these 2 iridium domes that allowed us to communicate live, to stream live from Antarctica, which is almost an impossible thing to do, and we weren't sure whether it was going to work until we actually were on the ice. Then, as Dominic pointed out, we built a studio in London in the Willis building, in the lobby of the Willis building, and did hour-long shows every morning, but instead of talking about ourselves for an hour, we did a quick update of the expedition, and then moved on to debates around issues that are related to global warming, climate change, environmental issues around the world, focusing on the human consequences. And that means the impacts of deforestation, food security, the role of big data in helping us understand climate change and act on it, how young people can affect global change, these kinds of debates that we brought in experts and also people that strongly disagreed with us, or me, really. There were skeptics of climate, and they had debates with people who who had different perspectives. And at the same time, while we were doing this every day on the ice, we harnessed big data technology from EMC Corporation, that was one of our leading sponsors, that looked at social trends, how people were talking about climate change around the world, throughout, before, during, after the expedition. So how much buzz there is around the issue, what are the attitudes, is there a negative, positive mood around progress, around decline, everything. So this was sort of the scene for the expedition. And what we did then was we had this project laid out, and on November 18th, we all basically went, all of us on the team went to Chile to start preparing for the expedition. As it turns out, when I got to Chile, I was informed that there was a customs strike and all of our scientific equipment was lost, and that at the same time, 20 minutes later, I got a phone call saying, the US government has no record of your scientific permit, so you are not allowed to go do your, and if you do ever find your equipment, we won't let you have it. And this was kind of an obstacle for us because we weren't going to drive across the continent doing nothing. And we had 5 days to fix an issue that would ordinarily take on the order of 90 to 120 days. What ensued was a series of miracles that I don't even really understand today even how they happened. First off, I went to the Chileans to beg them for support. The Chilean Antarctic Institute was very generous and provided some equipment for us to use for most of our scientific crossing. We still had the issue of permits. Now what happened was there was a storm at the landing site in Antarctica that delayed us for a week, which bought a little bit of time, during which the British Antarctic Survey wrote a letter expressing support for the potential value of our results, which ended up influencing, or it allowed the right agencies in the United States to approve our permit at short notice. And I think it was 1 day before we ended up leaving, which actually was 5-6 days late, that we got the approval. And everything was kind of the same as it was supposed to be, but after a rather hectic couple weeks of running around. So we started our journey on November 29th. We have a rather odd team when I think about it. Out of the 5 of us here, there's 4 nationalities. Everyone has different skill sets. All the way on the left is Patty Scott, our cameraman. Did an incredible job in the worst of conditions. Doug Staup in the blue jacket there is a very, sort of a legendary American polar explorer. He was the first American man to walk to the South Pole. And we did a couple of North Pole expeditions together before this one. Ao, Icelandic driver and mechanic of the Arctic truck and general savior of the expedition on multiple occasions. And then all the way on the right, Nathan Hambrook Skinner, who actually works for Willis, and who underwent some very intensive polar training to join us and deal with all of the communications, both the technologies involved and having the communications plan to make sure we could do what we wanted to do on the ice. So we started out, unfortunately, now Icebroker is an amazing vehicle, but Antarctica is still a pretty tough place. And on the 3rd day of the expedition, out of a potential up to 45 days on the ice, or 50 days, the inverter broke in the truck, and the inverter is this little device that turns engine power into electricity. So we had no power. Then the heating unit broke at the same time. And the heating unit, it didn't just break, so we weren't just cold, because we could have handled the cold. It just decided to be an autonomous machine and go from hothouse to icehouse state without any sort of control or indication of when it would change. So 1 minute there could be frost on the inside of the cabin. The next, it actually melted the cap off of one of our fuel cans, and I woke up smelling gas, and that was the first major panic of the expedition that I had. It made for a fun experience. But either way, whatever happened in the truck, we still had an obligation to do the science right, and that's what we did. We all got out every day and did the science at regular intervals, did our ice cores, did our snow pits, and we eventually got every sample that we had hoped to acquire. So then what happened is that we reached the Ross Ice Shelf, and remembered actually that we now had to walk all the way back, and that was the easy part. And so we geared up, spent a night on the ice shelf, and we're ready to get going. Doug and I figured that we didn't need to acclimatize and take it easy in the first couple of days because we'd been in Antarctica for a while. We had gone up and down in elevation, and we were ready. So we straight away did 12-hour days, which was a really big mistake because we didn't know this at the time, but there had been a virus going around Union Glacier Base, which was our base camp before we started the expedition, which both Doug and I caught. And it was just a cold, but it started to manifest itself at the beginning of this trip, beginning of the trek. I was terrified. Doug never shows fear, but I was terrified that it would turn into a chest infection. And chest infection can end an expedition. We only had enough antibiotics to cure for 45 days for one person. So if this lasted that long, then we would have to end the expedition on the basis that one of us would still be sick. So I was thinking, end of day 2, we've done 65 kilometers, which is really good, but if things are going wrong at this phase of the expedition, there's a better than decent chance I've made a terrible mistake in doing this at all. But we kept going. We just continued to do what we could do. The thing about Antarctica is to get, the South Pole is at 2,835 meters. We started at sea level because we were on the ice shelf. But to get to the polar plateau, you have to pass the Transantarctic Mountains. And the only way through the Transantarctic Mountains is to climb one of the glaciers that flow out through the plateau, through the mountains and down towards the sea. Now, I wasn't particularly wild about this as this part of the expedition because I'm notoriously a complete wimp. But Doug, on the other hand, seemed to be really excited, all ready to go. He said, "I think we can tackle this in one day." And I didn't say anything. It's like, okay, we'll just do what we can, take it one step at a time. And so we started on the Leverett Glacier and moved 2,500 vertical feet in one day, 20 miles towards the pole. And I cried when we reached the top of the glacier because, tragically, the top of the glacier wasn't actually the top of the glacier at all. It was the top, what we had been staring at all day was the top of a small hill that concealed the actual glacier, which was miles and miles and miles in front of us. It took us 3 days to get beyond the uphill part of the expedition. And it was really after that that things started to become more challenging, that things started to fall apart. Because a cold, a cough, in combination with trying to acclimatize to altitude doesn't really work very well, especially when there's a lot of physical exertion. And I felt like I couldn't breathe very well. And so as a result, we ended up having this situation that was kind of like a physical and mental breakdown that led Doug and I to both doubt whether we would ever even finish the expedition or whether I had the physical capacity. And that was a very difficult moment for me because I felt like there was no more shameful way to end an expedition than to just realize that I wasn't strong enough. So it was kind of a hole. It was difficult to get out of, but at the same time, we were 250 miles away. I knew I couldn't do 250 miles. We had done 120. It's a difficult thing to visualize the end when it's so far away. There's a lot of power in visualizing success, but I found it not as easy to do when we had 250 miles to go. And it actually leads to a lot of errors in the short term, loss of focus, wanting to have that extra bit of comfort, maybe a longer break, taking a rest day, so tempting to not get out of the tent. Maybe going into our rations a little bit more than we should. And we all know that these decisions that create short-term gain with no outlook for the long-term, whether it's a long-term responsible decision, is not only detrimental, it has the potential to be disastrous. And for me, that brought up an important characteristic about the way that we have in the past approached climate change. Because there's been an occlusion of the long-term responsible approach for a shorter-term gain, for avoiding compromise in the short term. And we know it's not the responsible approach. Now, I knew that, again, I couldn't do 250 miles, but I figured that if the pole was 10 steps in front of me, there would be no excuse, right? Doesn't matter what's going on, whether you have a cough or a cold or broken leg, it doesn't matter. You can do anything for 10 steps. So what I would do is visualize the pole 10 steps in front of me. I was like, okay, the South Pole's there, walk 10 steps. And then do it again and again and again and again until we finish the day. And then I would be comfortable in the tent. And that was the savior of every day, is the thing that kept me alive, or not alive, but my mentality alive, was knowing that there was the end of the day where I could just be comfortable in my sleeping bag. The thing about Antarctica is that it's very easy to lose hope and to feel like there's nothing but isolation. And in this challenge that seems so big that one single action couldn't remotely have an impact, or course of action or decision. But actually, no one who's ever walked to the South Pole did it by taking a jump from the start point 350 miles to the finish line and landing gracefully. All of them before us did it by putting 1 foot 8 inches in front of the other 750,000 times. And that's sort of what I tried to keep telling myself throughout the project, and what was really the only thing that allowed me to get to the end. We kind of lost luck on the weather halfway through. First time weekend, we received a nice gift of 50-knot winds against us, minus 40-degree temperatures, and zero visibility. But again, it wasn't about telling ourselves that we needed to do another 250 miles of whatever this happened to be. It would end at the end of the day, and then maybe have to do it again, but we had to take it one time. So we reached the South Pole on December 18th. Sorry, no, December 24th, Christmas Eve, a month ago, after 18 days and 4 hours and 43 minutes of the trek, about a month in Antarctica. And we did break the speed record, but one thing I'd like to mention is, in the grand scheme of things, the record on its own doesn't mean anything. It's not a valuable contribution to society. It'll be broken next year, probably, by someone younger than me. I think where the whole story and the whole record becomes meaningful is in the broader context of the resilience theme around the expedition. And what that means is it could be any number of things. It could be a single moment of human resilience. It could be the resilience of an entire generation to work towards, in a collaborative way, solving an issue as broad, as widespread, as difficult, as complicated as global warming. But it also means applying new science and new technology to protecting communities, protecting businesses, individuals, homes, from the risks and the changes that we have created. And that's part of the reality of our approach, which is going to be partly adaptation, partly mitigation. But that's really what resilience means to me. And as we move into a world that's increasingly filled with different types of risks, it's going to be an important approach to the way that we deal with the climate change challenge. Now, I guess if there's nothing else about this expedition, I would like it to be viewed as a call to engagement. Not just into the climate change challenge in general, but among generations as well, between generations that each have a lot to offer. People my age now have more power than they ever did at any time in history. And this intergenerational collaboration has a lot of power and a lot of potential. But each of us here has a different background. I'm not old enough to have a background yet. But whether it's business or science or public policy or anything else, everyone has a role to play. And in 2030, we have to be able to look back on the decisions we made this year and think and be safe, be confident in the knowledge that when it mattered, when we still had time, we made the pivotal decisions that put us on the right path. And I think that that's going to be the challenge that my generation takes on and will fully embrace. So, and I also think it's more than a burden. But I'd like to just conclude by once again thanking all of you for being here. Again, I know that there's so many things going on at Davos and that this building isn't that easy to access. But I really appreciate you all joining us, and I look forward to a productive and collaborative 2014. So thank you very much.